just sent from up above. You know you make my world light up.
Yeah, so my name is Jasmine Pichaldo. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm originally from Bronx, New York, and I've been here in Maryland for 3.5 years as I've had a few different roles, but I was here as a grad student, and I've been a trainer for a facilitator for the Step Up program here on campus for a year before they switched over to their peer model. Also a diversity and education specialist in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, and now I'm here as a program manager in global communities. And then prior to coming here, I worked for 3 years with a college readiness program in Poughkeepsie, New York, working with area high school students, first gen, low income, mostly immigrant backgrounds, doing college readiness, but also like life development skills and literacy skills. Yeah. I think for me, so I'm a first generation student, and so going to college was new for my family, and realizing that as supportive as my family was, I was experiencing things that they weren't familiar with, and had to figure out what an additional support network looked like, since some of the issues I was having they weren't familiar with, and realizing like that there's a need for that, and realizing that when I became a senior, there were freshmen and even high school students who are having similar obstacles. It really motivated me to become like a peer mentor in undergrad, and then once I graduated undergrad, sticking around to work with low-income students, first-gen students, who were students that I really identified with because their experience was very similar to my own. Yeah. I think for me, a lot of it was, so I took like my first women's studies class, my first semester of freshman year, and the line that everyone knows that sticks with people is that the personal is political, and that really resonated with me because it gave me a language for what was happening to the women in my family, but also to for my friends, and even myself, and sort of how I understood partnership and power dynamics and my sense of equity. And so I had lots of experiences with folks who were experiencing sexual abuse, sexual assault, and I ended up being the person that people confided in, not knowing like, how do I support, right? My older sister was in an abusive relationship, and I was 16, and I was like, I don't know how to help you, right? Other than to like just bring you to my house and tell my mom, like, you know, my half sister has nowhere to go, and she also had like my 3-year-old niece at the time, and then even in undergrad, experiences with friends who experienced sexual assault or partner violence, and realizing that I tended to be the person that people confided in, and I was tired of not knowing like how to help the people that I cared about, and in those ways, people started reaching out to me to be like a sexual assault advocate on campus, and then when I got here, also working with Step Up as a peer, as a facilitator. Step Up is the bystander intervention program through CARES here at UMD. And so when it was initially launched 2 years ago, they were seeking staff to serve as staff and grad students to serve as facilitators and trainers on how to prevent sexual assault. And the program has expanded to also include other forms of bias intervention in terms of like microaggressions, racial incidents. And so when I started there, I did several trainings with like UNIV 100 courses on campus, and some of the living learning programs as well, in terms of trying to get students to become more comfortable talking about sexual assault on campus, talking about hookup culture on campus, and sort of the ways that hookup culture is like, those boundaries are really blurry between like consent and assault, right? And so helping students process that, but also thinking about like, how do I intervene in a way that is still safe for me, and in a way that feels comfortable for me, right? Because we often think that intervention has to be direct intervention, but it can be referring to someone else who is in a position of authority, or getting a group of people with you so that you have that additional support. And sometimes it's misdirecting, right? And just changing the conversation, or asking questions. So that was a lot of the training that I started doing with CARES, and then including through like diversity trainings on microaggressions and implicit bias. We also incorporate a lot of scenarios around gender and sexual identity. So I don't know if you like followed like the evolution of the Women's March online, but like early on when they were developing it, there was a lot of critique on social media because it was originally called like the Million Woman March, and there had already been one that was led and organized by women of color and Black women in particular. And so the critique at the time when they were developing the planning for this march was that it wasn't intersectional, and women of color and women of different backgrounds weren't being included in the planning. And so that was the initial critique. And the organizers responded to that, and added some diversity to their planning committee. And so that really, for my friends and I, we were like, okay, like, yes, people made a mistake and they made an effort to correct it. And so we went as a group. And then when we got there, I think we were there for 2 hours because like I'd been in marches and protests before, and it was a very different feeling. One where typically the marches that I've been to have been with predominantly people of color, and those marches get very antagonistic really early on with police officers. And that wasn't happening here, which we were like, okay, this is great. But also there were so many people, and there was this realization that not everyone who was there came with like an intersectional mentality. So there were Indigenous women who were smudging and saging the protest, like a section of the protest, and there were women that were complaining, and they're like, well, why are they, having this smoke out in the streets? With some of the speakers who were presented, like Janet Mock, who's a trans woman activist, like people were booing her. And so we felt really uncomfortable in that the diversity of women that were there were also being marginalized and pushed to the side. If you listen to like the CNN broadcast, you will hear like some booing in the background. And so we were like in the group where there was booing during Janet's speech, and we were just like, what is happening? This is so strange. And then also there were just also signs of women who had signs that said "Free Melania," and those were really jarring to us because we were like, Melania has made a choice to continue to be a part of this administration. Like, she could have chosen not to. She could have gotten a divorce. Like, but particularly she and Ivanka, there's always this notion that these are helpless women. And we were just like, no, these women are constantly making a choice to affiliate and associate themselves with this administration. And so we also were struggling to have conversations with folks about the ways that you're denying these women their agency because you don't want to believe that they would actively participate. But like, they have shown that they're actively participating in some of these policies, and in what for me is an administration that isn't interested in like the well-being of all U.S. citizens and humanity, right? Like, policies have been focused on benefiting a very particular group, and I think that speaks volumes. So I think like a lot of my activism really started in undergrad, and particularly around the treatment of workers on campus, particularly like non-exempt staff, right? So facilities workers, dining workers, and the fact that they were being either laid off or denied a raise, and there were attempts at union busting. And for me, because I was a student I had work study, and I often worked in facilities in the dining hall. Like, these were people that I knew personally and that I worked with. And also that I could identify with, because I was like, you do the work that my mom does, right? Or that my aunts do, or my uncles. And there was a lot of critique of our president at the time, because while these cuts were taking place, she was using university funding to renovate her presidential house, or was getting a raise. And so there were really concerns about like how the university was managing its funding and also how it was treating its workers. And I think for me, it's always been about recognizing the impact of this work and the impact of policies, right? And so like, who's being excluded, who's being marginalized, what are the consequences of, deciding to choose one vendor over another in terms of like when universities are merging contracts, right? Or the decision to create a strip mall that's all like corporate owned businesses as opposed to mom and pop shops, right? What does that do to the local economy and to the livelihood of folks who live in that community? And so for me, a lot of it has been being really observant about what's happening around me, and how the things that are happening behind closed doors that you'd like see a little article in the Diamondback or in your local paper, and then you actually go into that community and you're like, oh, like these are the ramifications of this, right? So now with the Purple Line, even people are asking questions like, what is this going to do to some communities, especially the Langley Park Tacoma community, which is a predominantly immigrant community that is going to have literally like a bus line and bus station running right through the community and breaking it up even more. I think that I really appreciate spaces for conversations as a place to start. I think that there are a lot of times where people are like, well, talking doesn't do anything, talking isn't enough. And I absolutely agree, but I also think talking is where we begin to change, right? Like, we need to create spaces where people are coming into contact with one another, are hearing each other's experiences, so that we can actually say, like, this is what this group is struggling with, right? Like, there's no way that I can come up for a solution to that, but like, they're experiencing it firsthand, so they know what the answer is, and they need our support to help implement it, because we may be the ones who have the resources. So I think for me, it's a lot of getting people to come together and talk about issues, and especially around sexual assault, even about like gender socialization. And like, often a lot of what people don't understand is that we have sexual assault, we have gender-based violence because of how we're socializing men and women, right? Because of the ways that you are supposed to perform masculinity. And it's also that people want to distance themselves from those extremes, right? So what I found really fascinating when I did, whether it was like facilitating dialogues around gender or doing trainings, people would always say like, those people over there, like, like, I don't know people like that. And I'm like, the perpetrator of the sexual assault was like a student on this campus. Like, so that could easily be someone that you're in class with. That's easily somebody that you are working on a class project with. So we have to be really mindful that even as we try to distance ourselves from something, we actually can't do that because we're all being socialized in the same context and in similar ways. And so how do we begin to develop self-awareness around that?